Okay, so this session, I wanted to cover off on some of the diagrams and basically the solution overview design. So for this solution, it's trying to set up in such a way that analytics can provision their own SageMaker notebook environments. And so as part of that, there's a lot of infrastructure changes, a lot of configuration changes, and just over the last couple of days, I've had to generate some documentation and some diagrams. So I just thought I'd explain some of these diagrams and how it all fits together. So to give you an idea on how this solution actually works. Okay, so in a solution overview document, it's normally there's some context, a description of the current state architecture, future state architecture, all the components, and how they kind of fit together. Then you're covering off things like costs, risks, business impacts, technology impacts, other options and alternatives that have been considered in the dependencies, assumptions, decisions, and I've just added implementation, so it's more diagrams and whatnot. Anyway, so that's just, it's largely a document to give you some sort of background in terms of what the solution is doing, why it's doing it, what's the current state, what are we trying to work towards, and what does this really look like, and what's the sort of impacts it's going to be. Okay, anyway, that's not what I really wanted to cover, but I wanted to cover off on the diagrams to explain how it actually sits together. Okay, so what we're trying to build is some sort of pattern to allow analytics users to spin up SageMaker notebooks. So you can go into your notebook environment, start writing Python code, start pulling in data from S3 and transforming it, probably running like pandas or NumPy against your data to transform it, generate features, all that feature engineering stuff. Anyway, so just to explain how this diagram actually sits, you've got RACQ at the moment, you've got all the different systems, so Policy Center, Claim Center, Dynamics 365, all the data coming into Click. So Click is reading that data, right? And then it's pushing that data into S3. So Click is acting as a basically ETL, well, not really transforming the data, but dumping the data and logging into S3. Now we are staging the data into Redshift also, but it's either or possibly both into S3 and Redshift for analytics, reportings, and ML purposes. Okay, so that's all the kind of existing solutions. Then we have the users. So if you have if you think of people like data scientists, data wrangling, building data marts, all those kind of activities, those are the users. So those users would be making requests into Service Catalog. So they'd be requesting an environment. They're requesting a SageMaker notebook environment. Then the Service Catalog would be provisioning a SageMaker notebook. Okay, and so that's here. Just to give you an idea of all these different boxes, you've got your AWS account as a whole. So that's going to be within the AWS production environment. Then this is saying that it's going to be within the Asia Pacific Southeast-2, which is the Sydney region. Then you've got same sort of thing, Southeast-2A, which is a zone, AZ. It's a subzone. There's normally 2 to 3 zones within a given region. So within the Sydney region, there's A, B, and C. Then you've got the VPC. So that's a virtual private cloud. That's like a little LAN network within the Amazon cloud. And then we've got the subnet. So that's a network within that VPC. And then lastly, we've got this red box, which is SG, which is a security group. And the security group is simply the firewall that kind of resides on the instance itself. So if you think about what ports am I going to open? Am I going to allow port 80? Am I going to allow TCP connections? Those kind of things, that's also handled by security groups. Okay, so once you've got your SageMaker notebook here spun up within this subnet, which is in the VPC, in this region, in Sydney, on this account, which is the production account, then that will have access to Athena, and then Athena has access to Glue. So Glue is where all the external table sits, where the definitions on how to parse the S3 object. Okay, and then you've got S3. If you want, it should have read and write access to S3. Different buckets have different read and write access, but just for simplicity, I've just dumped it all into one line connection between SageMaker and S3 notebooks. So this is just an explanation of the diagram of once it's all deployed, this is how it would look, and this is how it would generally operate, with the users requesting an environment, then Service Catalog provisioning a SageMaker notebook, and then the users would be able to access the SageMaker notebook to do their work. Those notebooks would be deleted on request and created on request, and also have a 60-minute idle detection for automatically shutting down and just reducing costs. Okay, so that's just the deployed end state. Now, as part of this solution, we thought that we'd try and also take this opportunity to try and implement CDK at the same time. So CDK, to use CDK, you actually have to what they call bootstrap, or you can think of it as initialize or set up your AWS account in such a way that it can start accepting CDK solutions. So in this diagram, we have 3 different accounts. We have the Dev Analytics Discovery or Development Environment or Development Account. Then we have the Infrastructure Engineering's Base Account, which is also their development environment. And then we have the last one, which is the Production Account. And you can see that when we bootstrap or set up an account with CDK, it ends up deploying IAM resources, so that's normally roles and policies. It also sets up an ECR, which is Elastic Container Registry. And lastly, it has an S3 bucket. And the S3 bucket is used to basically stage the artifacts that are to be deployed, right? So when you're deploying resources into an account, it's probably good or best practice to use CloudFormation. And when you're deploying CloudFormation, it's all based off templates. And what happens is those templates are staged into S3, then CloudFormation is run. CloudFormation reads the S3 templates and then deploys the solution into your environment or account. So this is what it would look like when you just set up each of the environments running the bootstrap command into each of the accounts. Okay. So next is, if you had set up your different accounts. So again, if we look at here, we've got CDK Toolkit, which is this little section here. I'm saying that on our development account within the Sydney region, you've got one toolkit, and on base, you've got another toolkit, and on production, you've got another toolkit. So this is just to demonstrate what it might actually look like to deploy a solution using CDK and what the pipeline basically looks like. So you've got your developer here, and he or she's developing their code and saving their code into code commit, right? Then you've got code pipeline here that is reading the code from code commit, and then it goes through a process. It goes through a process of reading the code from code commit, then it uses code build to build the code. Say, for example, if you had some programming language that needed to be compiled into binary before executing, then that would happen in the build process. Now, we also use code build to perform some of the unit and integration tests. So that happens all there. Then next thing, code pipeline would also use Lambda. It uses Lambda-backed custom resources to actually test the CloudFormation templates. So as part of the CDK pipelines, there's a feature for the pipeline to actually detect when you're actually trying to elevate the permissions that are being provided in your solution. So say, for example, your version 1 of your solution just provides access or read access to an S3 bucket. And then let's say version 2 is saying, okay, actually, I need read and write access to that S3 bucket. So there is a feature in CDK pipelines that will use the Lambda function to detect, hey, in this new version 2, they're asking for elevated permissions and they want to now also write into that S3 bucket. So that's built into the CDK pipelines. Then after all of that is done, then we use CloudFormation to deploy into our given development environment. And then during the deployment, it's assuming different roles. So if you think of a deployer role, it defines what CloudFormation is allowed to deploy into the environment. Okay, so during this whole process, it's also using S3. So S3 in this example, I've kept it within the boundaries of this pipeline. And for this workflow, code pipeline is staging the artifacts as it goes through reading the code, building the code, checking the code, and then deploying the code. Through each stage, it's saving its progress into S3. And then here we have key management services. So KMS, and you've got a key in there, and that key is used to encrypt the data at rest, and that's the data on the S3 bucket. So it's encrypted at rest, but it's also encrypted because anytime we do want to offer cross-account access, so let's say we've got our production account and it wants to be able to read data from the development account bucket, then that's a cross-account action, and anytime you allow that, it has to have KMS attached. Okay, so that's the development account. Now, what I wanted to highlight is from the development account, we now have the ability to cross-account deploy into external accounts. So in this example here, we've got our infrastructure engineering's base account. And I'm just highlighting that, yes, their base account still has a CDK toolkit, and this is set up in such a way that code pipeline is actually allowed to deploy into CloudFormation, assuming a role on the base account, but then also reads the deployment artifacts from S3, and then also S3 bucket is also copying the deployment artifacts from the developer account, right? So you've got all the deployment artifacts saved here. Those are copied into this bucket on this base account. That's being read by CloudFormation. CloudFormation deploys those templates and assumes this IAM role and then deploys all the resources within this base account. And so the same sort of thing, it happens exactly on the production environment again. Copies the deployment artifacts, CloudFormation reads those deployment artifacts, and also assumes that IAM role to, I guess, restrict and determine what it can and can't do. So that's how a, I guess, standard deployment or CDK deployment would happen in a cross-account environment. Now, this last tab in this last diagram is slightly different, and this is because for the SageMaker notebook environments, we're trying to use Service Catalog. And so Service Catalog is a little bit special in that it actually allows users to provision their own infrastructure on demand. So it's basically giving users the permission to deploy new resources. And it's just, that is a bit, I guess, special, and it's a little bit too much permissions to just give out to all developers. So we've kind of changed it slightly, where we've still got the developer defining all the infrastructure, in code commit, and we still have a code pipeline, everything that's deploying everything locally so we can test it locally. But what happens, we have a DevOps person or infrastructure, someone from the infrastructure engineering team in the middle who actually clones the repository and then pushes all of those changes and configurations into another copy of the repository on the base account. So in that way, the middleman, the DevOps person, has the opportunity to review what's actually being deployed. So this is, I guess, separation of concerns and a point where this person can review the changes that are being deployed into production. So back here, you can see this line goes from the development environment, the code pipeline. It's able to deploy all the way into the production account. But then when you look over here, the code pipeline has only permissions to deploy locally. It doesn't have permissions to deploy into base, and subsequently doesn't have permissions to deploy into the production environment. But other than that, other than this middleman here, everything remains the same. So now we've got infrastructure engineering having copies of the code here stored on the base account. And then here we've got the code pipeline process, which again is going through the same process of building, checking the solution, deploying the solution locally on the base account, and then this pipeline has the permissions to deploy onto the production account. All right, that was it. Thanks.